And I remember when I recently went to India. It's not that recent anymore, it's about almost a year ago now. And one of the things that you talk about when you go to India, you talk about the life of the Buddha, because you go to the places where he was 2,500 years ago. And it's natural when you go to those places that you focus on who the Buddha actually was. And what you find out very quickly when you start talking about the Buddha is how little most people actually understand about who the Buddha was, what he actually did. And for that reason, it's actually a very useful way of coming to greater understanding of the Buddha, just by talking about this. And I remember myself, I was also surprised when I started reading in more detail in the suttas about who the Buddha was. I also had often wrong ideas about who he actually was. But sometimes you have to, it's like you have to go through the discourses of the Buddha with a very fine comb to actually realize who he was and to gain this greater appreciation of this historical figure who lived in India 2,500 years ago. And there are many advantages of talking about the Buddha. Many things, many ways this can actually enhance our practice of Buddhism. It can help us in many ways. And the first one is simply that, as I said before, many people have a very distorted perception of actually who the Buddha was. Very often the stories that we read about the Buddha, they are often not very reliable, unfortunately. Often they are based on late works of the Buddhist tradition, works that happened a long, long time after the Buddha, and they are much more legend and mythology than they actually are history of who the Buddha was. And because of that, it's the legend and mythology, by definition, is something which tends to be inflated. It tends to be changed. It's not really a reliable historical record. A legend or a myth, there can be maybe a core of truth to these kind of myths and legends, but a large part of it is going to be a distortion of what actually happened. So to understand who the Buddha was, we have to go back to the Buddha's own discourses, what he said 2,500 years ago, and only then can we get a reasonable appreciation of what he was and what the Dhamma was all about in relation to his life.